it's important to note that already at this point, and we're not even near finished with the excavation, that we've recovered more Native American pottery than in the last 30 years combined.
No, where now? In the United States or in the state?
In Connecticut.
In Connecticut, okay.
Or I should say what we have found in Connecticut.
Right.
But there's just not very much. It doesn't preserve particularly well. It's not like European hard pottery. But what's really significant about it is that it was decorated in very specific cultural ways. And that's going to be a really important tool to figure out where these people actually came from and who they were most closely related to, and even maybe what language they spoke. We're not even sure what the language is. Again, is it closer to the Delaware language or is it closer to the Mohican Pequot? We don't even know that because there's just so little information about that. And this is just a really critical period in human history. This is a global scale kind of excavation because this is a time when Europe and Asia and the Americas actually came together for the first time, and there's all these contact points all along the Americas, and we don't know a lot about what happened, and it was sometimes peaceful, sometimes it was violent, but it was really the beginning of the modern world that we live in. That changed, it changed the world forever when Europe and the Americas came together, and it would never be the same. If you're talking about exchange of foods and ideas, it just goes on and on. So, in terms of sort of a big scale, big picture thing, this is going to play a really important part in not just Norwalk history, but really, and not even the history of New England, but really, and even a more global scale, because it was a very international period, and it was a period of exploration. We know that this fort dates to the earliest period of European settlement and exploration. It's something we call the contact period, and we believe that this fort was built by the Norwalk Native American group basically to conduct trade with Dutch traders in New York. We believe this because of some of the artifacts that we've actually been getting already, including some really beautiful glass trade beads. We have evidence that they were adopting guns or firearms, and also things like trade axes and iron knives and things like that. But it's clear already that it was a very selective kind of trade, that the natives only wanted certain things that were meaningful to them and that were practical. But also at the same time, which is very fascinating, is that they're also maintaining a lot of their traditional ways and maintaining their traditional material culture. So they have access to this new technology, but they're still making their own pottery. And so we're getting this really beautiful decorated pottery sherds that the Native American women would have been making. They were also making stone projectile points, for particularly arrow points. They were also doing a lot of hunting. We have evidence of deer and ducks and skunk and raccoon and things like that, and fish. We know that they're collecting shellfish, and they're also making what we call wampum beads, which are shell beads that were used for trade, but also Native Americans integrated them into their rituals. It's a very rare site, first of all. There's maybe half a dozen throughout the entire Long Island Sound area, and a lot of those have actually been developed, and they no longer exist. While this area appears as a Native American fort in some early antiquarian histories, it's also important to know that if you read some more modern archaeological discussions of the area, it describes this fort as gone, as having been destroyed by the railroad. But not taking that for granted or assuming the worst, we actually did still come in and do some really intensive testing just to make sure. And then when we did that, we actually found evidence that a large portion of the fort actually has remained.
Did you find anything that as a result you said, wow, we didn't know that before?
Every day is like that in terms of, because we're getting so much detail you have to also realize that when it comes to the Norwalk Native American groups, we know hardly anything about them. We have a reference to an early deed that Sarah mentioned, where this land was in the 1640s when it was transferred to the English. But other than that, the name of some of their sachems or leaders, we know very little. So everything we get, every single piece we get is going to add something to the puzzle of who these people were and what they were doing. I mean, we don't even really know if they were more closely related to the Delaware of New York, or if they were more closely related to, say, like the Mohegans and Pequots. It's just this area has just been this giant blank spot of what we know of Native Americans at this time period. So virtually every single thing that we find adds something new and important to the puzzle. And because of the preservation of the site and the extent that's left, we're going to be able to reconstruct their daily life in just incredible detail.
So as a result, this type of research would, for example, end up in a journal?
Well, it's going to be, first and foremost, there will be a comprehensive report that details everything that we have found and where it was, including the artifacts or the features Mandy was talking about. Because we have to realize what we're doing is, we are preservationists. And when we locate sites, as Mandy said, it's first and foremost, they attempt to avoid, but when they cannot be avoided because of public safety issues, it's our job to take them out in the most detailed and up-to-date scientific methods possible to preserve that information through the artifacts, through photographs, and documenting everything that we found in extraordinary detail, exactly where it came from. And then that information will be available not just locally and other archaeologists, because other archaeologists throughout the entire eastern, North America will be very interested in what we have, but for generations to come, because we're going to be preserving it in this way.
And then ultimately the items you found, will they end up in a museum or some other place where they'll be on display or be available to other researchers?
Mandy, do you want to?
Sure, yeah. So the plan right now is, once all of the analysis is done and the reports are complete, the community has expressed interest in keeping the artifacts locally. So we will be working with David and the folks at the Norwalk Historical Society, along with the state archaeologist who controls the curation facility, for the artifacts that the state finds, and we will find a way to get it here, but also to share that. So the Historical Society has some great plans about some exhibits and some educational things that they want to do, so there will be a lot of opportunities to share this information. The state. So under state law, state artifacts that are found on state land go to the state repository, which is at UConn. I know that there has been instances where if a community does express interest in keeping them, they can be either maybe like a long-term loan or some type of agreement can be put in place, and that's the plan right now.
The level of detail and information that we have from this site, because the artifacts and features that we have are incredibly well preserved. We have thousands of food remains, animal bones, shell, fish bones, plant remains. There's charred maize and beans, and there's berries. We know like what people were eating, and we can probably figure out the seasons that people were living here at the site. So we can take the significance of this all the way down from the macro scale of, the global economy and contact and all of those things, down to the household level of what Native people were doing on a day-to-day basis. Because when this is all said and done, even though we just have a section of the fort that's left, the features that we have are going to help us understand how their houses were arranged, and what the day-to-day activities were, what people were eating, and just all the way down to the level of individual people and families and what they were doing. So the significance of this site, I think, hits on many different levels, and I think that that's one of the most important things. I mean, you can conduct research on this site for decades, I think. There's so much information here. Basically, this is was a small little spit of land that kind of stuck out in the marsh. It would be easily defensible because on three sides it would have been hard to approach. There's just a little narrow spit you could easily, block off. So it would be defensible. You could see in all directions because it's a high point. And the view from here, if all of these buildings were gone, you can see the water, and anybody on the water can see you. So, you know, if a Dutch ship was sailing by, you would know it, and they would be able to see this fortification as well. So I think that archaeology here, I mean, most of what we've found in this spot has been from this 17th century fortification, but we also have artifacts going back several thousands of years. This little piece of the landscape was a valuable part of the landscape for Native people for thousands of years. When you think about it, it's really close to the resources of the Sound and the river. It's defensible. It's in a good location. I imagine people revisited this place for thousands and thousands of years.
What do you believe is the oldest thing you found so far?
The oldest things that we have from this site so far are a couple of projectile points, so spearheads probably from the late Archaic period. And they're probably about 4,000 or 5,000 years old. But yeah, by far the bulk of the material that we've recovered, though, is from the 17th century.
Would you be willing to say more about the wall that you were referring to?
Yeah. Basically, it was a stockade. It would have been upright posts, one next to each other, and it would have somehow encircled the esker. And we know the esker, which basically it's this land formation. It's like a little island that was sitting in the marsh. We don't know if it was square like a European or if it was round. That we may not be able to figure out at this point, but we'll see. But we know it's there because it's basically we have a linear stain that's left by the wooden posts that were in the ground. And when you go over there, you can actually see, we'll uncover the sheet, and you can actually see this dark linear stain, and one of the archaeologists will point it out for you. Yeah. And so when we get in there, we're actually going to excavate it. And a lot of times we find good artifacts in there because the wall kind of naturally catches stuff, and it falls down into the trench. So it's basically, it was like a trench that they put these upright posts in. The posts rot away, and we just have this dark stain that's left.
So when you get into it, you would expect, if it is a wall line of posts, that you would be able to see oftentimes the stains from individual logs or sticks that were shoved down in there. So they'll be kind of, linear and pointy at the bottom, and you'll see them in a row.
Yeah. Well, we're some time away before we actually excavate those. We're starting on this end and then working our way towards the wall at this point.
Are there any stone formations that were built?
No, we didn't find anything like that, but that would have been very unusual because you have to realize these were mobile people, and they had no need to do a lot of big stonework because they're moving around to either plant fields, or they're moving inland to hunt, or they're moving down to the coast for shellfish, or they're moving to the river for fish. So the last thing they want is, doing a lot of intensive stonework or having a lot of heavy tools. So we can even see that when you look at the materials. The trade axe we found is quite small. It's like this big, but it's perfect for them, for people who are mobile. The knife is small, and then when you look at the stone arrow points, you're gonna notice that how small they are, and they're really delicate and really fine, because they were very much a culture in motion. And when you are a culture that's moving in motion, you don't want a lot of stuff, and the stuff that you have is going to be really beneficial and really useful. Things like firearms they adopted quickly because they saw what an advantage it had to have something like a musket, but that was something that they could also take with them when they're moving to place. And then an axe, building houses, building canoes, so many different uses. But an important thing is that they're very selective of what they're getting. They're not just taking whatever the Dutch brings. They're dictating what they want. The Dutch are providing it, and they're maintaining traditional culture in pottery and in stone tools, arrow points that they want. So it's a very interesting transition between the culture before contact and then the first arrival of the Europeans.
So in other words, this area here wasn't used as a permanent residence, but it was more like a temporary encampment where they would come and go?
Exactly. I think, as Sarah was saying, we're going to be able to get at what we call seasonality based on what we find when they were here. We think that they were, at this point, they were likely here in the spring for shellfish and to trade and wait for the Dutch because they had just got their winter furs. But they probably came back at different times for fishing or whatever. But this is not like a village that they lived at all year. This is more like just a fortified place that they used. And we think the primary use of it was for trade.
They probably weren't here in the winter.
Yeah.
It would be a pretty lousy place actually to spend the winter. It's unprotected, it's very windy.
Yeah.
People would tend to go inland to do their hunting and things like that in the winter.
Yeah.
And the food remains that we have kind of bear that out. We have
Yeah.
a lot of summer fruits and fall nuts and species that you'd get, spring, summer, fall, that part of the year.